It's my great pleasure tonight to welcome Bernard Chapais. He received his PhD in animal behavior from the University of Cambridge. His PhD from the University of Cambridge in 1982 in animal behavior. Currently, Bernard is professor of anthropology at the University of Montreal, where he served as founding director of their laboratory of behavioral primatology. He has done extensive research on free-ranging macaques and also undertaken innovative experiments on primate social relationships. After a quarter century of studying nepotism and kinship and other topics among macaques and other primates, together with Carol Berman, he co-edited a very influential volume published by Oxford University Press in 2004, Kinship and Behavior in Primates. Better than anyone else I can think of, Bernard Chapais understands that to be truly evolutionary, anthropologists need to bridge the yawning chasm between primatology and sociocultural anthropology. And with this in mind, he set out to determine the deep structures of human social systems unobscured by humankind's famously elaborate cultural overlays. And he did so by returning to Claude Lévi-Strauss's 1949 classic Les structures élémentaires de la parenté. Brilliant but dated and written in that era's total ignorance of actual primate social organization, Lévi-Strauss's elementary structures of kinship nevertheless provided Bernard with the kernel of insight he was searching for to explain the role that pair bonding has played in transforming non-human ape family ties into human kinship systems. The resulting tour de force of careful, extremely fair-minded scholarship, really a model of scholarship, his book, Primeval Kinship, was published by Harvard University Press in 2008. He's followed it up with several other articles, notably in 2013 in Evolutionary Anthropology, his article on monogamy, strongly bonded groups, and the evolution of human social structure, which lays out alternative models for non-human to human ape transitions that he hopes will prove testable using the paleontological record. Today, he will share his insights on phylogeny and the evolutionary analysis of human behavior. Please join me in welcoming Bernard Chapais.
Thank you very much, Sarah. On my way here, on the plane, I recalled something funny concerning us. A few years ago, we met, Sarah and I, at ASU, at a colloquium organized by Kim Hill. And after the usual greeting, Sarah said to me, "Bernard, what a fastidious book you've written." The problem is that in French, fastidious is fastidieux. It's the same word, and it means boring. Repetitive and boring. So, really, so for a fraction of a second, I kept asking, is my book really boring? I don't know. But I deducted that the two words had different meanings. A brilliant deduction I made. Okay, I know you're tired. It's 8:30. Your stomachs are full. You've been listening for 4 days of very interesting talks. So I've tried to prepare something that was, well, I hope you'll find digestible. You tell me. And I hope we'll have time for some questions, but I made a repetition today and it was a bit close. Anyway, so also, of course, I'm extremely happy to be here, extremely honored to be here, and I thank the committee for, the organizing committee for inviting me. It's the first time I think I had the privilege of addressing an audience about the relevance of primate studies for, I mean, an audience like yours, formed by human behavioral ecologists, evolutionary psychologists, about the relevance of primate studies for human behavior. And I'm very pleased to do that. So I've listed here, first of all, when I will say comparative primatology, I mean the phylogenetic approach or the comparative approach, method, applied to the comparison of primates and humans. So comparative primatology, these are the 3 or 4 main points I'll be talking today. I'm going to argue that comparative primatology is really uniquely positioned to understand the origins of what I call complex human social patterns, things like a patrilineal kinship structure or marital arrangements, things that are obviously not present in primates, which is counterintuitive that primates should help us understand those patterns. I'm going to argue that comparative primatology provides a phylogenetic type of evidence that these patterns are what I call natural social cultural categories. That is, categories that have a biological foundation and a culturally polymorphic content. And also that these categories are what can be said to be context-specific universals. That is, patterns that are always present whenever a given set of circumstances are met, so that they are universals in those circumstances, so context-specific universals. And this will lead me to revisit very briefly at the end of the conference the notion of absolute universals, which seems to contradict this notion of context-specific universals. Also, yes, that's the 4th point. I'm also going to make the point that I think the phylogenetic approach informs functional approaches in 2 ways, but today I'll be concerned only with the 2nd way. I'll take 1 or 2 minutes at most to describe what I mean by the first way, the first type of contribution, which is that if you know the prior social state out of which a trait, a behavioral trait, for example, evolved, well, this sets very strong constraints on the functional models that are concerned with the evolutionary origin of that trait. And I'll give an example with monogamy. Let's say you're interested in the evolution of human monogamy, and you posit that it could have evolved either from a previous state of chimpanzee-like sexual promiscuity or from a Madrya's baboon-like previous state of polygyny, a species in which, as you know, they form harems. Well, depending on these 2 prior states, your functional models will be very different. If you start with the chimpanzee-like promiscuity to monogamy transition, well, your model will, by definition, have to account for the evolution of stable breeding bonds out of a multitude of, short-term breeding bonds. And you'll probably resort to a paternal provisioning hypothesis, high cost of maternity, paternal provisioning. But if you start with this prior state here, Madrya's baboon-like system, well, your functional model doesn't have to account for the pair bond itself. It's already there in the form of polygynous bond. What your model has to account for is the reduction in the number of females per males, which is completely different. Then, in fact, you'll have models that are concerned with constraints, on possible constraints on polygyny, the costs of polygyny. And in that paper Sarah was referring to in Evolutionary Anthropology, I'm proposing 3, elsewhere it's 4 different hypotheses about the evolution of human monogamy, positing that it evolved from a prior state of polygyny where the pair bond was already there. The stable breeding bond was already there. The 2 different types of prior states impose very strong constraints on functional models. So I think that in that sense, the phylogenetic approach is important for people interested in people using functional approaches. So that's what I'm going to say about this first contribution, because I'm concerned here today with this second contribution. I'm going to argue that the comparative method or phylogenetic approach reveals that some patterns, some complex kinship, social patterns may be emergent products of a combination of more elementary things rather than the result of specific selective pressures. This morning, was it this morning or yesterday? I don't remember. I was listening to a very interesting talk by Robert Lynch about these, and this was this morning? Yes, okay, I'm all lost. About these marital arrangements and, exchange of spouses between patrilines. I'm going to talk about marital arrangements quite a lot today, but what I wanted to say is that people using functional approaches just take for givens, and that's perfectly normal, that marital arrangements exist, and they try to test functional hypotheses about the adaptive character of those arrangements. Whereas in my case, I'm interested in how the whole set of circumstances that led to the very possibility of marital arrangements evolved. Okay, so it's a very different question, but as you will see, they are very much related, I think. Okay, allow me to remind you first, very briefly, that primate studies help us understand human behavior in relation to two very broad objectives. I'm not concerned with the first one here. That is, this first objective is that primate studies help us model the behavior of hominid species. That's a very important area of research, but I'm not concerned with this today. I'm concerned with this second objective, using primates to understand, to identify the evolutionary building blocks of human behavioral phenomena, which is precisely what makes it possible to infer the evolutionary origins of those behavioral phenomena. So I've classified all the studies I know about these comparative studies, about these comparative analysis between primates and humans, into four categories. First of all, you have studies that are concerned with the evolutionary origins of human psychological mechanisms, things like theory of mind, self-awareness, deception, emotions, attachment, social learning, language. Of course, I could cite people for each of these topics, and this is not exhaustive, of course. A second set of category are concerned with the evolutionary origins of major social processes like reciprocity, sharing, altruism, nepotism, cultural transmission, competition. A third category of comparative studies are concerned with the origins of specific types of bonds, origins of mother-offspring bond, the father-offspring bond, the pair bond, friendships, grandmothering. And finally, a fourth type of studies are concerned with the origins of specific categories of activities: hunting, tool using, nonverbal communication, dominance, coalitions, lethal rating, conflict resolution, sexual conflicts, incest avoidance, and others. That's a lot of studies. Now, the important point here is that all these human behavioral phenomena share a number of characteristics. First of these is that, of course, they all break down into more elementary components present in either a large number of primate species or a small number of primate species, which makes it possible to reconstruct their evolutionary history. The second point is that all those phenomena are present in other primates. Sexual conflicts, grandmothering, friendships, pair bond, father-offspring bond, nepotism, altruism, they're all there in primates. You can see them, of course, in forms different than the forms you see in humans. The third point is that they're so basic, those phenomena, that it's obvious that they are made up of a number of hardwired components or evolved mechanisms or Darwinian adaptations. Fourth point is that not all of them, but many of them, the majority have been studied in chimpanzees, which means that the similarities can be explained in terms of homologies, often. And the last point, perhaps the most important one, is that all those traits are present in all human societies. They are absolute universals, which makes a lot of sense, and which explains why Peter Capeller and Joan Sill could edit a book on the contribution of primate studies to human behavior, a book titled Mind the Gap, Tracing the Origins of Human Universals. Makes sense because we expect our primate heritage to be present in all cultures. Well, I'm not concerned today with these four categories of behavioral phenomena. I'm concerned with the fifth one, which I call the complex sociocultural patterns, which I define as recurrent structures of social relationships that break down, like the four others categories, into evolutionary building blocks. Things like patrilineal, also matrilineal, but you'll see why I'm talking about patrilineal kinship structures, affinal kinship structures, and marital arrangements. Now, the important point here is that these complex social patterns differ quite a lot from these four other categories. First of all, the phenomena themselves are absent in other primates. Of course, you don't find any marital arrangements in primates. The hardwired components of these things here are not so obvious. They are not explainable as simple homologies. It's too complex. And most importantly, they're not cross-culturally universal. Marital arrangements, for example, are not, of course, as you know, universal. So this, I think, explains why they've been relatively neglected by comparatists. It's not obvious that primate studies should help you understand that kind of mechanisms here. So I'll be concerned now with these three types of three mechanisms here, beginning with patrilineal kinship structures, which I define in a very, very general way as structures of social relationships reflecting kinship through males, including the transmission of privileges or status. In other words, a patrilineal kinship structures like this one here is simply a socially differentiated or socially visible or salient patriline versus just a genetic patriline, socially silent genetic patriline. So these structures, these patrilines which are fleshed with interaction and behavior are absent in non-human primates, and they're not cross-culturally universal. So what can primate studies tell us about their origins? Fortunately, even though we don't have patrilineal kinship structures as I described them just a few seconds away, we have a mirror image of patrilineal structures, which are matrilineal kinship structures, which can be defined, well, if I go back to this definition here, they are structures of social relationships reflecting kinship through females, including transmission of privileges or status. We have that in Cercopithecines. And those structures happen to break down into at least 9 evolutionary building blocks, which I've listed here. They all involve a multi-male, multi-female group composition. They all involve female phylopatry, which creates extensive matriline. They all involve male transfer, familiarity-based kin recognition mechanism, which are based, by the way, on the existence of lifetime mother-daughter bonds. They all involve cooperative activities among females that are kinship biased, a female's dominance hierarchy, and a pattern of favoritism of daughters by mothers. Now, this breaking down of this type of structure leads to the idea that to obtain the mirror image of this thing here, a patrilineal kinship structure, you would need the exact same 9 building blocks, but adjusted in relation to sex. These building blocks here. So a multi-male, female group composition, that doesn't change, but this time you would need male phylopatry instead of female phylopatry, female transfer instead of male transfer, and so on. A male dominance hierarchy instead of a female dominance hierarchy. Humans assemble all these things here. But what is really interesting is that our closest relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, exhibit 7 of the 9 elements, and I've listed them here. The 2 elements lacking are those one here, underlined, lifetime father-son bonds and favoritism of sons by father. Of course, these two things stem from the existence of stable breeding bonds or pair bonds. Because, of course, if you have pair bonds, the father can recognize his offspring and he can favor them eventually, which leads to the idea that the first patrilineal kinship structures emerge in the human lineage after the evolution of pair bonding in multi-male, multi-female groups that were male phylopatric. I insist on the fact that I'm talking about the first and the most basic type of patrilineal kinship structures. So this is a kind of phylogenetic model of the origin of a patrilineal kinship structure, even though that structure doesn't exist in other primates. Now let's have a look at the main features of this model of patrilineal kinship structure. The first point is that what I'm saying is that a patrilineal kinship structure is the emergent product of the combination of a number of evolutionary building blocks. These blocks are either homologies, homoplaces, or human-specific adaptations, so that a patrilineal kinship structure has a composite biological foundation. And of course, it means that it did not originate as a cultural creation. Of course, they are all culturally constructed, but they did not originate as cultural creations. That's the first point. The second point is that even though these kinship structures have biological underpinnings, they are socioecologically modulated in two ways. First of all, their occurrence is context-dependent. They require the 9 elements that I just listed before. For example, if you don't have male phylopatry, you cannot have a patrilineal kinship structure. This element is required. And the other important, I always mix in these. The other way in which it is socioecologically modulated is this way here, is that the exact form taken by the structure will depend on the forms taken by its 9 elements. For example, briefly, if you consider status, if status is based on skills, as it is in foraging societies, well, it's not easily transmittable from fathers to son. If it's based on wealth, it is. So the model allows for a lot of cultural variation. This means that a patrilineal kinship structure from a phylogenetic perspective is a natural sociocultural category, meaning by that it has a biological foundation and a very polymorphic content, culturally speaking. But this doesn't mean that those, what I call natural sociocultural categories, have an existence of their own. And what I mean here is that what exists out there are patrilineal kinship structures. You have 3 here. Number 1 in environment 1, number 2 in environment 2, number 3 environment 3. These 3 structures share a number of commonalities, a kind of PKS constant, if I may say so, which in turn implies that these commonalities have biological underpinnings. But the only thing that exists out there are the patrilineal kinship structures and the biological underpinning. This thing here is an abstraction. The PK is constant. The sociocultural category does not exist. It's an abstraction, but it is a useful, in my view, conceptual interface between biology and culture. It reveals how human nature structures cultural diversity, in the sense that if you remove this, what are you left with? You're left with a large number of very different, culturally very different structures. And you cannot put order into that. So you need these categories, even if they are abstractions. I just wanted to make that clear. So what I've said about patrilineal kinship structures is that they are emergent products of the combination of a number of building blocks. They are nonetheless socioecologically modulated, and they form a natural sociocultural category. This leads me to my second example, the final kinship. Here you have 2 groups, only 1 family per group, and there is a marriage here a single marriage linking these 2 families. This marriage creates a final bond between this female here and her sister-in-law, mother-in-law, brother-in-law, and it creates a final bond between this husband here and his brother-in-law, mother-in-law, and father-in-law. Final kinship structures or final bonds are absent in the other primates, as first noted by Robin Fox in his 1980 book, The Red Lamp of Incest. How did they evolve? Well, the first thing to consider is that the final bond results from the linkage of 2 types of bond, a kinship bond and a pair bond, as illustrated here with 2 brothers-in-law who are, of course, as you can see, linked together to the same female. Such linkages, this whole thing here, break down into a number of building blocks. A multi-male, multi-female group composition, a dual-phase pattern of residence, you need pre- and post-marital residence, the existence, of course, of stable breeding bonds. By definition, you need preferential bonds between kin, but you also need a pattern of intergroup visiting so that the two in-laws can meet each other. And you need, of course, opportunities for cooperation between in-laws. When these conditions are met, they set the stage for the evolution of cooperation between brothers-in-law. At least that's the theory, that's the idea. For a number of reasons, 4 reasons at least. First of all, because the two males, the two brothers-in-law, are disproportionately familiar to each other because they're connected to the same female. So compared to the average pair of male in the group, they will meet more often. The second reason is that both of them share a vested interest in the same female. One as a husband who derives direct benefit from the well-being of his wife and children, and the other as a brother who derives inclusive fitness benefits from the well-being of his sister and nieces and nephews. So they are, in that sense, they are de facto allies. What I mean by that is that given that they share a vested interest, if the female were to be attacked or threatened, well, they would likely join forces to protect her because they have a shared interest. The third point is that the female herself has an interest in both males for similar reasons, so that she's expected to mediate peace between them. And this is ethnographically documented, as you know. And the fourth point, which is not the less important, is that these two males are not sexual competitors owing to incest avoidance. So all these factors here contribute to make them natural allies if, of course, there's cooperation. So the idea is that there's no need, in my view, to evoke specific selective pressures for explaining the evolution of affinal bonds per se. I'm not saying that you don't need selective pressures to explain the evolution of cooperation between males, of course. But I'm saying that if there are selective pressures for the evolution of cooperation between males, well, these guys, these brothers-in-law, for example, would be highly predisposed to engage in that sort of preferential bonds. So to summarize, this second example, affinal kinship bonds, they would be emergent products of the combination of n building blocks. They would have a composite biological foundation. They would be socio-ecologically modulated, and they would form a natural socio-cultural categories. Which leads me to my biggest example, my more complex than third example, the evolution of marital arrangements, which are, as you know, of course, reproductive agreements between families, and a further development of affinal bonds from the present perspective. So how did they evolve? First of all, let's have a very brief look, because you're all familiar with that, I know, at what they are, and especially what are their commonalities. First of all, you have the classic daughter or sister exchange, depending on the point of view and its variance, in which here you have two sisters who are married to each other's brothers. This illustrates the movement. I mean, this is a patriarchal society with the movement of the sisters or daughters. So sister exchange or daughters exchange. And of course, you have variants. For example, we were told this morning by Robert Lynch that the father can exchange his own daughter, not for a daughter for his son, but for a spouse for himself. There are variants, of course, but the principle is the same, exchange. You also have, in big class of marital arrangements, you have cross-cousin marriage, in which the children issued from daughter or sister exchange, these guys here, will marry each other. In fact, cross-cousin marriage, it's just the extension of exchange to the next generation when you already have daughter exchange. Marital arrangements include the levirate, of course, in which a woman whose husband died will marry her husband's brother. And you have so that's a kind of replacement principle. And you have the reciprocal, of course, the sororate, in which the husband whose wife died will marry her sister. Replacement principle again. And finally, you have things like bride wealth, bride service, in which there's a transfer of wealth or service from the groom's family to the bride's family. Now, all these things I've just enumerated very briefly have in common, all these marital arrangements, they are affinal structures that share two basic features. First of all, they're all founded clearly on exchange, on contingent reciprocity to be more precise. And second, they all involve the parental control of mate choice, the capacity of parents to vet their children's preference for marital partners. What I'll be proposing here today is that marital arrangements are the emergent products of the building blocks of a final kinship I've just enumerated before, these blocks here, merging with the cognitive abilities underlying two things, contingent reciprocity and the parental control of mate choice. These two things together will have produced marital arrangements. That's what I'm going to elaborate upon in the next minutes. What I'm going to argue first, that as soon as the parental control of mate choice evolved, matrimonial exchange was bound to follow. I'll come back to this assertion, but this means, if you believe it, this means that the key question becomes, how did the parental control of mate choice evolve? Is it a kind of Darwinian adaptation with its own specific evolved mechanism, or is it something else? From a phylogenetic perspective, I think that it is not a Darwinian adaptation as such. You don't need a mechanism. I'll come back to that later. But what I'm proposing is that it's just one particular manifestation of what I call the instructional control of others. What is that? Well, in non-human primates, you have what may be referred to as the non-instructional control over others. Individuals can prevent others from doing something, they can allow them to do something, but they cannot, of course, give instructions. So to do that, to do preventing and allowing, what you require is a power asymmetry, first of all, that is a clearly defined dominance relationship, and the motivation to control others. When you have to do these two things, you can engage in that type of control. Now, in humans, we exercise instructional control. In addition to preventing and allowing others to do something or not to do something, we can orient their behavior by spelling out directives. This might be the emergent product of the old primate-like non-instructional control, merging with new cognitive tools, language, which gives you the capacity to spell out directives, and theory of mind, which is important because it allows you to try to really influence the thoughts and the beliefs of others. So these are powerful tools. And when you add to that the fact that of all types of relationships, the parent-child relationships it appears to be ideally suited for that type of instructional control, owing to the marked age difference between parents and children, and also the high degree of emotional and economic dependence of children in relation to parents. So if we posit that after the evolution of language and theory of mind and probably other cognitive abilities, I'm simplifying here, if you posit that after the evolution of these things, parents were able to exercise instructional control, the question becomes, what about this specific domain of control, the control of mate choice? Again, is it a Darwinian adaptation with its own evolved mechanism, as has been proposed by Apostolou, who did a great deal of very interesting research and who published a very large amount of papers on marital arrangements? He thinks that you need to invoke an evolved mechanism to explain that motivation of parents to influence mate choice. Well, I think that if you think in these terms, you have a problem, because what about all these other universal parental propensities? verbally interrupting disputes between siblings, inducing children to take care of their younger siblings. These are universal things, I believe. Inducing children to contribute to subsistence activities and helping children acquire competence in a large number of activities, having children adopt specific beliefs, and so on and so on. Are we going to argue that we need evolved mechanisms for each of those propensities? I think there's an alternative, another possibility. Of course, it's a possibility, it's an hypothesis. The idea is that such parental propensities would be extremely basic, and more specifically, they would be basic because all parents are motivated to exercise instructional control, first of all. Second, all parents share the same motivational systems, cognitive abilities, and evolved psychological mechanisms. And all parents, that's important, experience the same categories of contextual opportunities eliciting those propensities. That is, all parents have children who will marry, all parents have children who could help them with their younger siblings, could help them in subsistence activities. So as a result of those constraints, motivational, cognitive, and contextuals, parents would be highly predisposed to acquire those propensities. I mean by that those propensities would be individually acquired. They would require a minimal amount of social learning, so that those propensities would crop up independently in different groups. In other words, they wouldn't be cultural traditions. They would be culturally constructed for sure, but they would not have originated as cultural innovations. I think they would be easily learned individually. So if I summarize what I just said, if I sum up what I just said, we start with the primate-like non-instructional control of others, which, merging with new cognitive tools, produce the instructional control of others that we have in humans, which in relationship with the strong power asymmetry that characterize relationship between parents and children, produce the instructional control of children, which in interaction with a universal set of psychological and contextual constraints generate a large number of universal parental propensities, including the control of mate choice. Now, how do we go from the control of mate choice to matrimonial exchange? Because I said that the two were very intimately related. Well, if parents do control mate choice, let's assume they do control mate choice. This means that they are in possession of a highly valued resources. They have marital partners, they have spouses that they can exchange. Well, no, let's forget exchange first. I'm trying to explain why we have exchange. But this implies that families from then on will have to deal with each other to obtain spouses. They have become mutually dependent because there are those who control the resources. So as soon as you have parents control and mate choice, the families become mutually dependent. So they have no other choice, no other alternative but to exchange. In other words, matrimonial exchange would be a correlate of the parental control of mate choice. Provided, and now I go back to socioecology, I mean to the contextual factors, provided two conditions are met. Matrimonial exchange must be advantageous to parents, first of all. We know that it is in many, many societies. Apostolou has done cross-cultural studies and found that it's very beneficent in terms of political alliances and all this stuff. But it is not necessarily advantageous in other societies. For example, in our post-industrial societies, it's not obvious that we need to form political alliances by marrying our children. Sometimes it is, when you think about these marriage between kings and queens. But it depends on society. And the second factor here is that parents must be in a position to impose their preferences. Again, as noted by Apostolou, this is often the case, but in Western societies where children are financially independent, well, parents cannot as easily impose their preferences. So this leads me to reason that you have 4 categories, in theory at least, you have 4 categories of socio-ecological context, A, B, C, D. For example, in class A context, well, child exchange would not be advantageous, and parents would not be able to impose their preferences, so you do not expect to have matrimonial exchange. In class B, child exchange might not be advantageous, even though parents might be able to impose their preferences, and so on. Only in context D do you have the 2 conditions met so that you expect matrimonial exchange. To sum up, again, what I'm saying is that the 9 building blocks of matrimonial exchange would be, when they are operating in a specific class of socio-ecological context, would generate matrimonial exchange, which leads us to the last question. How do we go from this to specific forms of marital arrangements? Well, in the present model, the building blocks of matrimonial exchange set a number of important psychological constraints on cultural innovation. That is, they would bias, that's theory, they would bias innovativeness, that is creativity, and they would bias cultural learning, with this resulting in innovations that are congruent with those building blocks here, being experienced as more appealing and standing a higher chance of being adopted. So we need those building blocks who produce psychological constraints. Of course, what determines whether a specific innovation is congruent or not depends on the socio-ecological context. Okay? It's context specific. So it is this relationship between socio-ecological context and those propensities here, those constraints, that would result eventually in the selection of congruent innovation, things like sister exchange, cross-cousin marriage, levirate, sororate, bride service, and of course a multitude of other variants in the cultural forms. So as you can see in this model, we need, in fact, in this model, marital arrangements have a very long, very profound evolutionary history, but they are heavily modulated by the socio-ecological context. In fact, you cannot do without this or this, and you have to go through culture, of course, and you have this as a result. At what time did I start? Sorry. It's 9:15?
You started at 8:30.
Oh, I'm fast, okay. Because, okay. The last point I want to talk about, and I want you to be brief about that, it's the implications of what I just said, the whole reasoning for human universals. The complex social patterns I've been talking about, patrilineal kinship structures, marital arrangements, are context-specific universals in the sense that they are present whenever a given set of circumstances are present. They are universal in those contexts, so they are context-specific universals. Whereas the notion of absolute universals seems to imply that those universals are independent of context. They are, above context because they're everywhere. So how do we reconcile this notion of context-specific universals with that older notion of absolute universals? If you have a look at Brown's list, Brown's, as you know, Donald Brown, of course, in his book Human Universals, produced a long list of universals that Pinker summarized in a list of 400 or so elements in an alphabetical order. When you extract from this list behavioral universals, I'm not talking about cognitive universal, linguistic universals, because it's a highly heterogeneous list, as you know. Well, when you extract these behavioral universals, you have reciprocity, rituals, nepotism, sexual division of labor, kinship terminologies, leadership, and of course, many others. Well, the idea is that those absolute universals are themselves context dependent, but that those contexts are universals themselves. So that the contextual requirements of, let's say, reciprocity or rituals or nepotism are met in all cultures. So they are dependent on context, but the contexts are universal. It's not that they are context independent. And this, by the way, explains why absolute universals are very often defined at a very high levels of abstraction, meaning by that they are very often very general, because to be universal, they've got to be very general. If they're too specific, they won't be. So what I'm saying is that absolute universals, in fact, are a very specific, highly specific subset of context-specific universals. In fact, all universals are context-specific, and absolute universals are just a small class. And they are those patterns whose context of occurrences are universal. That's rare. We're lucky to have them because in fact, we have to go at high levels of abstraction to find them. Which leads me to reason that looking for absolute universals as a means of substantiating human nature is certainly valuable, no doubt about that. But it's remarkably restrictive when you think that human nature is everywhere, that it pervades many context-specific sociocultural patterns like marital arrangements. Marital arrangements, of course, are not in Brown's list. They're not near universals, they're not absolute universals, but they are context-specific universals, and they are because they have a biological basis. And even highly infrequent and marginal context-specific patterns may be termed universal. And I'll end the talk with one example I was giving in my current anthropology paper, the same example. If you consider life in prison, in my view, it's a natural sociocultural category and a context-specific universal defined by a number of commonalities, for example, strict dominance order, strong ethnic alliances, high rates of violence, high rates of homosexuality, and others. And those commonalities occur in a very specific set of circumstances, some of which are listed here: seclusion, of course, ostracism, unisexual population, high population density, extremely limited repertoire of activities. So what I'm saying is that the fact that this very specific set of contextual conditions determines these specific set of commonalities reflects human nature. I mean, we're built for that causality here. Of course, that's an hypothesis. But what I'm saying is that even though life in prison is a very unusual pattern, except in the States, it seems, let's say for a Canadian, let's say, even though it's very, very, not very rare, but I mean it touches a fraction of the population, it illustrates the power of human nature because of this relationship here. I'll end here. I thought I would take an hour and a half, but I was quicker. Thank you for your attention.